There's a storm coming. No, cut that out. Hello and welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. My name's Ed Dixon. I'm the deputy editor here at Sports Pro. The Six Nations starts this weekend, so I'm joined by Michael Long and Sam Carp to look at the latest goings on there ahead of the tournament, including a wider look at whether rugby needs to rethink how it operates if it wants to grow and break into new markets. We'll then be discussing why things don't seem to be going quite to plan for Ineos with its sporting portfolio. And there's also a bit of time to look at the latest on the NBA's plans in Europe as Adam Silver talks up the potential of a new league on the continent. Right, gents. Normally when we talk about rugby, we draft in Sports Pro's resident rugby apologist, Steve McCaskill, but he was unavailable today, so no pressure.
Drinking too much iron brew, wasn't he? Up from Scotland. Those are the rumours going round.
I don't think it was just iron brew he was drinking by the sounds of it.
Well, he's returned just in time to drink a load of Guinness or whatever his tipple is for the Six Nations.
That's an effective title sponsorship right there, Mike. I think if you are linking Guinness to the Six Nations.
Yeah. All in the plan.
Seamless. To be fair about the Six Nations, we do probably take it for granted because it's always how we've known it here in the UK, but this is like one of the few high-profile annual international sports tournaments that's capable of attracting millions of viewers consistently, and it's still being shown on free-to-air TV, which feels like it's sort of becoming much more of a rarity these days. Sam, in keeping with the last couple of episodes, we sort of tend to open every podcast with, are you going to watch it?
Well, I don't know if listeners are familiar with my views on rugby. I don't mind it. I'm one of those people who probably typically watches rugby when something like this is on, less so outside of that. And you always know when the Six Nations is on because it's impossible to get a pub booking in central London. And serendipitously, the first weekend of the Six Nations this year falls on the end of dry January. So I imagine that the phones at the pubs have been ringing since the start of this year. People locking in their first session of 2025 for Saturday.
Steve McCaskill.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, I will be watching some of it, probably. Incidentally, it's probably not the type of thing that I would actually put on more if I was just at home and kind of an afternoon, 5 p.m, 3 p.m. fixtures have just finished. I've watched the scores come in and there's some sport on BBC or ITV, and that's probably how I'll end up watching it. I'm not one of those people who has made a booking for Saturday at a pub. Someone's actually made that on my behalf. I'm going to a 30th birthday at a pub during the rugby. So maybe I will catch it out of the corner of my eye. So yeah, I'm sure I'll tune in for some of it. How about you guys?
Yeah, I'd say I'm similar. I would say I'm a fair weather kind of rugby fan, but I don't think there's much fair weather in during the Six Nations, and certainly not in my part of the world on the border of England and Wales. But there is a pretty healthy rivalry, and you definitely get that sense. I'd often wonder how far those kind of rivalries that exist within the Six Nations kind of transcend the Six Nations themselves. And I know we'll come on to talking about the kind of global appeal of a tournament like this, but it is the pinnacle of European rugby. There is always a build-up and a bit of a palpable kind of buzz around it, certainly among rugby fans, but it certainly reaches into the kind of casual fans, and there's that tribalism and, as I said, the rivalries. So it definitely draws me in. I'll definitely watch it along with the Rugby World Cup, but I certainly won't be watching it kind of religiously. I won't be sculpting my weekend around the matches and the fixtures. I'll watch England, Scotland always, England, Wales always, but I won't be watching Italy, France.
Yes, I'd probably fall into the same category as well. Although, as a Southampton fan, I think I'm trying to find excuses to watch many other sports.
Sure. Premier League football really isn't that appealing right now, is it?
Yeah. I guess there's been a lot of speculation this week, though, around where we could be watching the Six Nations, on which channel in the UK, at least from 2026 onwards. Rugby Pass ran a report on Monday that TNT Sports are basically all but set to secure the rights to Six Nations from 2026. But within a matter of hours, seemed to have amended that article, I imagine, after being contacted by an angry member of the Warner Brothers Discovery Sports team, perhaps, included a statement in there saying that TNT would be interested, but it'd be particularly challenging to take those rights or to lure those rights away from the BBC and ITV, where it's currently shown in this market for some obvious reasons. Yeah, we've got that rights tender coming up. I don't know what you guys think. I feel like that conversation comes up all the time, doesn't it? When rights are up for renewal, part of me almost wants pay TV broadcast just to get it so we can get rid of that narrative once and for all. I don't know what you guys think, how damaging would a move, like a potential move, I should say, like that be from someone?
I think the national governing bodies are in a bit of a tricky situation, I think, because they need cash and they kind of need it now, and pay TV would allow that. But the downside is it would surely eradicate any growth the Six Nations has. The Six Nations is actually considered it's synonymous with free-to-air television. And while a switch to pay TV would give that immediate income boost, provide a bit of security for some of the national governing bodies, it just feels like a double-edged sword. And you mentioned it earlier, Sam, the conversation around switching to pay TV, it seemed to have got a lot louder this year. I mean, it's obviously no coincidence because the BBC and ITV's current deal expires this year. Rugby union is facing even more competition from other sports, and it means revenue expansion is going to be really, really, really important. And if you can't do that through your media rights, how else are you going to do it, particularly for a sport like rugby that lacks that global appeal of, say, a football, or indeed can't rely on a incredibly lucrative domestic market like, say, the NFL. So it kind of feels like the next rights deal is going to say a lot for me about where rugby goes, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere for the remainder of the decade, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I just can't see the organisers kind of sacrificing, the millions of viewership that they get currently on free-to-air, that reach for a bit more revenue. And I think it is only a bit more in terms of what TNT's been linked with. Current deal with BBC and ITV, I think, is around £90 million a year, rising to £100 million ish a year if it went to TNT, which isn't a significant hike, let's face it. So I think it wouldn't make a huge amount of sense. And I think from a national governing body perspective, you've got to weigh the two, and you reach in revenue as always. But in terms of growing the game, growing the profile and sustaining that, I think it's super important that it stays on free-to-air TV. But perhaps, it's within their interest to have pay TV broadcasters sniffing around, because they can use that as leverage to get a bit more money out of the free-to-air broadcasters if they need to. Albeit, we know what their kind of financial situation at the BBC is, but presumably they would be keen to retain what they have at the very least. I don't see the benefits at this moment in time of just chasing the money in this instance.
Yeah, I do tend to agree. I think it would also be quite maybe lazy move, just expecting a rights deal with a pay TV broadcaster to magically fix all of rugby's financial problems. I think there's a lot more deep-rooted issues than that. But also, just to play like devil's advocate for a second, I do often think that the free-to-air in a sport like this in particular, maybe gets over-egged in some cases. I can see the free-to-air argument for exposure for a sport like women's football and the role that's playing in growing the Women's Super League, for example. But rugby is it does have a pretty established fan base. It's been around for a long time. I know you mentioned, Ed, that it's, maybe it doesn't quite have that global appeal, but it is slowly starting to expand into other markets, and things are becoming more competitive in some of those emerging nations as well. So I do sort of wonder if that argument about the Six Nations needing to remain on free to air for the sake of that exposure for the sport is maybe a little bit outdated. And especially because I feel using TNT Sports as an example, they've now got a lot of rugby coverage. It would make sense to have, all the sort of major properties in one place. So it would make it easier from a user perspective anyway. Maybe if you could sort out some sort of free-to-air coverage alongside that, it would work. So I don't know. I feel like there's an in-between solution here in a way. I just don't think it's as simple as looking at it through the lens, pay TV is bad, free-to-air is going to solve everything kind of thing.
When you say similar arrangement, kind of like what TNT Sports is going to have with the FA Cup, that kind of thing.
Maybe, yeah. I know it was like Premiership Rugby, for example. They have all their games on TNT Sports under their new rights deal, some games on ITV. Maybe the free-to-air element of that is not as much of a needle mover, because I don't think club rugby draws in the casual fans quite as much as international rugby does at the moment. But I think it's just something to think about. Obviously, free-to-air does guarantee more exposure for sponsors as well. So there's that to factor into it, which is obviously an important revenue stream for the Six Nations. But I don't think on either side, it's not as black and white as saying a pay TV deal would fix all the problems. I don't think it's as black and white as saying, free-to-air exposure is the only way for this property to flourish.
Yeah. And ultimately, it doesn't need to be exclusively one way or the other. I think it would be a hybrid model. I mean, Six Nations isn't protected in the UK. It's not a crown jewel event. So it doesn't have to be on free-to-air TV, but obviously we're talking live rights. There's obviously highlights and delayed coverage and things that can go out through free-to-air, which might satisfy a lot of the casual fans anyway. As we say, we don't the three of us don't build our weekends, or, it's not appointment to view in the same way as it would be for the core audience, but we would probably catch it later in the day if there was a show on free to air quite happily and feel like we're following along. So you're right, Al. I don't think it's necessarily black and white. But interestingly, you talk about, this conversation being kind of outdated. When we think about the global appeal of rugby and specifically something like Six Nations, in my mind, it's the similar in profile, I think, rugby as a sport to, say, cricket.
Yeah.
Where there are these kind of outdated, like weird quirks and anachronisms. The Lions tour every 4 years, that's just kind of like baffling to anyone but the traditionalists, and to the uninitiated, to outsiders and youngsters and things, like, oh, that's a kind of strange thing, but it's quite cool, and it generates interest in the same way some of those tours in cricket do. But obviously there's the kind of history of the sport and how it's grown up, British colonial roots and things like that, and therefore interest and participation skew towards a few, key markets. But then I think similarly to cricket as well, within rugby, you've got this kind of stratified structure. It almost like this ingrained classism where you've got like a handful of elite countries that effectively rule the game, and then these smaller nations that are struggling to get a look in, claims of being ring fenced, and, lack of opportunities to compete against the big boys and things like that. The international calendars are always a bit confusing in both sports. You got the IFs obviously trying to address any, issues there with new competitions and realignment, expansion of the World Cups and things like that. But to me, there's a lot of similarities there between rugby and cricket that they're facing. And I'm not sure every sport has to be global. I think it can be massively relevant and resonate in certain markets and still be a very healthy sport, and doesn't have to just kind of be this kind of global thing that spans all time zones and all corners of the globe. But therefore, I think the business challenges and the political challenges that rugby faces are very similar to cricket as well. And obviously, we are seeing increasingly organisers of various tournaments and the global governing bodies just kind of really grappling with how the sport can resonate beyond that core audience, grappling with what formats and approaches work best for which markets. Rugby just hasn't cracked it, I don't think, in terms of how it grows the game. We sit here in the UK, me personally, on the border of England and Wales, like the Six Nations does resonate. But the point I made before is I just don't know, does someone in Portugal really care about it? Does someone in Northern Africa really care about it, or anywhere really? But in terms of what approaches work for which markets, we talk about sevens, there's different formats. They're in the Olympics. You've got the traditional 15s. We often talk about the men's game, but, is the women's game more appealing in certain markets? Is it international teams or clubs that are going to draw people in? Is it tournaments or leagues? Is it athletes? I think we should talk about the role athletes can play within the growing rugby globally. But yeah, I don't know what you guys think. I've just kind of ranted a little bit there, but it feels like all the challenges that rugby faces, aside from the kind of financial ones in the domestic game in the UK that have been well documented, there isn't this kind of clear sense of coherent, kind of joined up purpose of like what are they going to market with globally? And maybe there doesn't need to be, because you do need to take it market by market. But to me, it just all feels a little bit kind of confusing and ultimately, maybe a bit outdated, and a lot of kind of traditional things happen year after year, and people are reluctant to embrace change within the sport.
Yeah, just on the cricket comparison, here in the UK, you could probably count the number of test matches that have been shown on free to air on one hand since Sky Sports and BT Sport, now TNT Sport, came in. Has the sport lost interest? Has it got bigger? Has it, you can sort of depends what metrics you want to read. There's more money in it, but that for players that came from the formation of the IPL though, and T20 competitions. So that was more of a fundamental shift in how, in competitions surrounding the game, and also that's at a domestic level as well. So it sort of implies that rugby's perhaps ripe for disruption, which again traditionalists may not like, but it highlights that's kind of the state of the game at the moment in rugby. And it does make you wonder, to your point you made, Mike, about sort of, does rugby need a rethink in terms of how it sees itself? What role can athletes play? Because I think if you ask any rugby stakeholder or a diehard rugby fan, they would say one of the strengths of the sport, it's very clear about what it is. It's kind of, you play hard, but you shape your opponent's hand at the end of it and you have a beer or something like that. It's very stoic. It's sort of stiff upper lippy. A lot of people like that,
A lot of people think it's boring.
Exactly. I sort of feel, Steve's calling me. Hang on. No, he's not. But I think the way rugby union is now and what it's going for, it isn't necessarily conducive to becoming truly commercially viable. And let's face it, a lot of fans probably don't want that. And that's their right. They maybe don't want to see it being sanitized in the US, being Americanized or anything like that with halftime shows. But, there were some quite interesting quotes we covered. There were a few from Michael Yormark from Rock Nation. Of course, they're involved in rugby. They've got some big name players signed up. He says there are too many traditionalists that want to do things in a traditional way. To be a truly global sport and breakthrough in America, it has to do things differently. And one of the things he cited was they need to uncover superstars. Because for me, I think rugby is actually, because you've got these big, huge guys, you've got guys weighing upwards, 18, 20 stone. Some of them are very fast. They're very powerful. They're almost like superheroes. You could almost feel like they can so really lend themselves to having like top trumps or anything like that. You could really market that. And of course, they're not wearing pads as well, like an NFL player. So it sort of feels like you could sort of build them up as these superheroes kind of thing. And that would give rise to these athletes that are, incredibly sort of appealing, particularly to younger people, you've sort of seeing them as superheroes. And that was kind of a comment that Alona Mar made earlier this year, that, she wants to see men's players sort of really put themselves out there more like she has to kind of help rugby grow. So I think rugby, it's very stoic, but it may well need to think differently if it's going to grow, essentially.
See you in the marketing team and do a deal with Marvel. But who actually, who do you, because this is the thing as well, right? When you talk about building up the athletes, who is the biggest rugby star in this country right now? Could you pinpoint one? I feel like perhaps the biggest star in men's rugby at the moment is probably Antoine Dupont, and we saw him cement that during the Olympics in the sevens. He's kind of probably the best player in the sport. But you go back to 2003 and thinking Johnny Wilkinson, and it just feels like there's no rugby player in this country has kind of reached that level since. Is that just because he was, very unique in what he was, or is that kind of an issue within the game where the athletes haven't been marketed enough, they haven't been empowered enough to kind of, showcase their personalities? Do you think of something like Ellis Genge has spoken about in the past? We've seen spin characters like Joe Marler, for example, who've launched their own media platforms and podcasts and that kind of thing, and people do engage with them. But I'm struggling to think of that many other examples of that kind of thing.
Yeah, but Johnny Wilkinson won a World Cup, which helps.
He was popular before that as well.
Yeah, no, he was. But I think what Adidas did very smartly at the time was they did so many campaigns with him and David Beckham. They really sort of put them in the same realm, I should say. And I think that really helped his profile. You had this elite world-class footballer star, and then you got this rugby player. They were kind of synonymous with each other. So that is, obviously at one market, I'm not saying you need to get a rugby player in the modern era and just do a similar kind of activation. I'm not saying that, but yeah, the ingredients don't seem to be there to be able to do that again. And yeah, to your point earlier, biggest star in this country, probably Maro Itoje, Marcus Smith, he signed with Rock Nation. Maro Itoje has just been named England captain.
How many of those race to cheetah though, Ed? That's obviously what you need to do. I think Johnny Wilkinson obviously emerged in a very, very different time, very, very different media landscape, where I think kind of all eyes pointed to those big tournaments. And, there was this lack of democratization in the media, which has obviously happened through social media and the fragmentation of platforms and attention and things. So I think he had that platform where probably had a lot more people kind of focused on him for a specific amount of time, leading up to and during that World Cup in 2003. I don't know. I think it's one of the things we talk about a lot, obviously, around our 50 most marketable athletes ranking that we put together as Sports.Pro and have done for the past 15 years is, who are the standout stars in rugby? And you can't always pinpoint them. Obviously, you had Dan Carter and certain All Blacks and certain Springboks over the years, as well as England players who, I guess, transcend their national borders. But really, the kind of compelling brands, if you like, haven't been the athletes. They've been the collectives, the England team, the Springboks, the All Blacks, etc., that have really drawn people in and kind of really have that aura, I guess, around them. But as Ilona Mayer was saying, there are other means now to appeal to fans and to crack new markets and things like that. And you do have to think differently about how you go about developing your profile and your personality, whether it's through content creation and being consistent there or, other ways of doing that. Obviously, Michael Yormark, I think, was speaking more specifically around cracking America for the game. And obviously there's a couple of World Cups coming up at the end of the decade, men's and women's, I think, in the US. So there's a strategy there within the global game to kind of really go after America. And perhaps athletes are the way to do that. Go athletes first. There's Major League Rugby in the US, but that's not saying a huge amount. I'm sure it does very well in the 12 market. The progress has been made. I think they set a record attendance last season, but we're still talking 10,000 max in terms of, the numbers they draw into their games. And as you've seen, calling yourself a major league in the US isn't necessarily the way of cracking the market. Look at Major League Soccer after quarter of a century as a domestic property. It took a Messi to arrive to really take it stratospheric. Obviously, Beckham played his part, but fundamentally where it is today is MLS's global media rights for the next decade are worth about the same as Google pays, I think, for Sunday Ticket in the NFL. One package of rights, and Apple's rights to MLS are global. So I just think, it's a hugely competitive market in the US, as we know. And obviously cracking America isn't the same as going global. You can obviously make a meaningful inroads into the biggest sports media market on the planet, but that's not the same as being a global game. Does rugby need to be global? Why always more and bigger? And why could it not just be better? Why could it not just have a better product, a more interesting, product that people can follow?
So almost having something that's more competitive, so it's not always the southern hemispheres that are turning up at the World Cup and winning it, that kind of thing. Yeah, to your point as well, World Rugby estimates capturing just 1% of the US sports rights market would double the sports revenue. So it does give you an idea of where it's at. I still think, Sam, you said earlier about the Marvel element. I just think we've done a lot here at Sports Pro about the role of the athlete in helping their chosen sport grow. And I think rugby union is better suited than most to really leverage its athletes to do that. Because they are essentially like these kind of, they're the biggest, they're the fastest, they're the meanest, that kind of thing. They're basically like sort of, if anybody watches the reboot of Gladiators, they're kind of like that. It does feel like that. Seems to me like the women's game is embracing that more than the men's game.
Yeah, I think so. Interestingly, I don't know if you guys saw an article it's running on the BBC at the moment, and it basically asked the question, are we living through a golden age of the Six Nations? Very statistical, they're leaning on Opta data and whatnot to tell that story. But are we living through a golden age of the Six Nations? Yeah, we might be. But is the Six Nations doing enough to really shout about that? I don't know. The focus of the BBC article is on the field. And yes, maybe it is a golden age. There are closer matches, less predictable matches, record try scoring happening. But how many people are aware of that? And does that translate into off the field? I think that's where it's a bit difficult to say because, as we've been saying, it has a buzz around it, has the rivalries. They're in season 2 of a Netflix series.
Which is getting cancelled, apparently.
Well, it's back for season 2, but it may get cancelled. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that, Netflix series and a drive to survivification of a sport was seemingly the answer to everything, but clearly it's not. They are trying stuff. They've gone through a rebrand, which was met with a lukewarm, let's say. It was hardly well received when that dropped in December. We've spoken about the media strategy and things like that. Again, it's uncertain. Whatever's happening on the field is kind of almost, to your point, Ed, incredible athletes. Of course, they're the top of every sport. Incredible, phenomenal athletes with stories to tell. But is the sport doing enough to tell that story is the big question. I'm not sure rugby is, to be honest. It just hasn't got its house in order. It's not figured out the calendar. It's not figured out where it's going.
And it sort of feels like a broadcast deal is kind of the least of its problems, really, doesn't it? Now, if there's one thing we do like on this podcast, it's laboured segues. And Mike, you mentioned the All Blacks, and one brand partner of the All Blacks is, of course, Ineos, run by big Sir Jim Ratcliffe.
Well played.
Smash it. And that's how we do it. Of course, Ineos have been in the news. Well, it seems today they're never not in the news in terms of what's going on at Manchester United, but it turns out they're not having the best of time of it, not just in football, but also in sailing. Mike, what can you tell us what's been going on there?
2 nights having a run-in right now. One for Ben Ainslie, most decorated Olympic sailor in British history, going up against Sir Jim Ratcliffe, founder of Ineos. Ineos Sport Venture has fingers in various pies. What do they own? Let's rattle them off. You mentioned They've got a partnership with the All Blacks. I think they own a portion of Mercedes F1, obviously a big old chunk of Manchester United. What was formerly known as Team Sky, the cycling team, is now Team Ineos Grenadiers. And then they've got a couple of other football teams, Nice and Lausanne as well in their portfolio, which I think they're in the process of reviewing in some way, which we can come on to. But it's specifically in sailing, there has been a bit of a fallout to the British team's inability to win the America's Cup last year. I think they were defeated 7-2 in the end by Team New Zealand. Ben Ainslie spearheading that challenge on behalf of Jim Ratcliffe and his, what were they called? Ineos Britannia?
Yeah, sorry.
But anyway, a bit of a legal fallout now in that Ineos are planning to challenge, but without Ben Ainslie. Ben Ainslie seemingly thought he was the one that was going to be challenging for the next America's Cup. Speak about anachronisms in sport and kind of outdated and kind of weird quirks. America's Cup's riddled with them and how it works in terms of having a challenger of record. And obviously the previous winner sets the rules and the protocol, the rules of the game basically for the next event, kind of dictates when and where it happens and what boats they use and just about everything to do with it. But yeah, clearly Ainslie and Ratcliffe have had a falling out, haven't been able to agree terms on, a joint challenge for the next America's Cup. And I think Ainslie's word that he used in his statement once Ineos said that they were going to challenge is he was astonished to find that it didn't kind of include him, I guess. So yeah, I don't know what you guys made of this. It's a bit of drama in sailing.
Almost as if to become one of the richest blokes in Britain, you have to piss off some people along the way. And turns out in sport, where there's probably quite a lot of egos when they clash, that this kind of thing happens. There was obviously that, but it just made me think of Ratcliffe's wider sports portfolio and kind of the success of those after they've received his investment.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof, exactly. Like if you look at kind of across the board, we're coming up to a year of him at United or there's been a year of Ratcliffe at United. There's certainly been a year since the deal was announced. I think it was announced on Christmas Eve in 2023 that they'd secured their minority stake. But you look at United there, obviously things weren't going to be changed in 12 months, but he's made a lot of kind of bad PR moves since going in there, including things like some of the comments he's made around the women's team, which clearly aren't a priority for him. They've made some layoffs. His work from home policy in relation to United, just all very heavy-handed. And then you kind of look at his other investments, some of those that you mentioned, Team Sky were notoriously the most successful team in cycling between 2012 and 2019, won 7 Tour de France. They had their worst year ever in 2024. And the team's chief executive came out a couple of weeks ago saying they're still going to participate from 26 to 28, but they're on the lookout for sponsors because they basically can't keep pace with some of the other teams who have got backers pumping money into them. And I know if Mercedes have been doing as well since Ineos went in there. I think Nice, to their credit, have remained pretty steady. But Ineos, it just seems to have now spread themselves across quite a lot of sports. And I don't know if it's kind of, with this whole United thing, I'm not sure if Ratcliffe maybe underestimated the size of the task that he was undertaking there. It was probably quite attractive. United was probably seen as this asset that just needed a little bit of love and would have been easy to turn around in the same way that maybe FSG did with Liverpool and got them back to the top. But I feel like since Ratcliffe gone in there, he's just kind of uncovered more and more problems. And if anything, despite being the minority owner, he's kind of now the lightning rod for all the criticism at that club, and the Glazers are kind of in the background a little bit, probably chuckling away, given that they're still majority owners and be able to cash in on that at some point. So, yeah, I think it was just kind of sort of a microcosm of some of the wider challenges for Ratcliffe at the moment and Ineos' sports portfolio, which is probably why we've seen some reporting. I think it was Sport Business who reported that, Ineos are kind of reviewing some of those assets. If you were Ineos gents, which one do you think, or maybe not Ineos, but which do you think are most likely to go?
I'd be surprised if he sticks around at Team Sky too much longer. You can pull the plug on that and be gone pretty swiftly. And, then they've got a sponsor gap to fill and it's on the team to fill it and whatnot. I think, he could extricate himself from that pretty quickly. I think in the America's Cup situation, he spent 200 million, something like that, on challenging for the last couple of America's Cup cycles. And, when you're investing to that extent, I think you're at liberty to kind of do what you want, basically. If that means getting rid of one of the most successful sailors in British history, then so be it. The Manchester United one's an interesting one because just the whole narrative around that club is just kind of he would have known what he was walking into, surely, that it just in a kind of state of disarray.
Well, I don't know if he did.
Probably didn't think it was going to get too much worse than it was when he originally invested. But, whatever happens on the field, short of getting relegated, as long as Manchester United are a Premier League club, they're still generating a serious amount of, commercial revenue, and talking about a new stadium and redevelopment of things. And they just this massive global brand. Not to say that they can rest on their laurels and they'll always be that. They've been usurped by others in many instances, including their cross-city rivals. And there's clearly a lot of work to be done, but I think he'll most likely stick around there and at Mercedes too. I think, it's a pretty compelling portfolio that they have, but obviously you can't just expect to win just by pumping a bit of cash in, and because it's such a competitive industry that you're operating in. There is an actual thing, Sam, called the Ineos curse, which was coined by former owner of Crystal Palace Football Club, which...
Hey, really?
Yeah, a man called Simon Jordan, who you'll know.
I've watched that man from my memory after... There was once a thing called the Simon Jordan curse, I think, after he put Palace into administration. So maybe that's where he got it from. But it also makes you think a little bit about, what is Ineos getting out of these investments in sport? It's invested in some teams. It's got a few sponsorship deals, you said. There's the rugby deal. It's got a small interest in running, I think. Obviously sponsored Chogi's sub-2-hour marathon. It's obviously not really it's not a consumer-facing brand, so it's not really exposure. Do you feel like, Ineos investing in sports like cycling and sailing, it's to kind of showcase its wares to potential business partners and that kind of thing? And you wonder if the narrative around a lot of these sports teams might be doing more damage than good to some of those business relationships. And at that stage, you start to wonder, is it still worth us being invested in this sector as heavily as we are? So perhaps that's another part of the reason why they're sort of looking at scaling back a bit.
Yeah, I think every global kind of chemical company needs to go through a period of self-reckoning at some point, and maybe this is it. Ineos.
A friend of mine who's a Manchester United fan, he stopped buying Ineos hand wash in protest. So yeah, that'll show him.
That's when you know.
Well, someone's willing to get their hands dirty, and maybe Jim Ratcliffe is as well.
One person who is maybe not getting his hands dirty, but certainly is keeping busy is Adam Silver from the NBA. See, that's another segue. That's what we do. We've seen Adam Silver say in the last week that the NBA is looking very closely at launching an independent league in Europe. Discussions still at a relatively early stage, but we could be seeing EuroLeague teams involved, the likes of Real Madrid. And he says everything is on the table for the new competition. Sam, why is the NBA so interested in Europe?
Good question. I think part of Silver has said himself that the game on the continent is growing, but basically the commercial growth hasn't necessarily mirrored that. Obviously, there's a lot of domestic competitions. We've seen one in this country really failed to get off the ground. The domestic game in the UK has never really taken off, despite a lot of promises and kind of undelivered promises. There's big domestic competitions in other countries like Spain, Italy, very popular in Turkey as well. But it's obviously kind of the EuroLeague is the sort of pan-continental European competition at the moment, which kind of generates biggest audiences, is kind of the premier competition in European club basketball. And I imagine Silver maybe thinks that the NBA could do a better job of commercializing basketball in Europe than they currently do. He's probably not saying that out loud at the moment, because I imagine that he perhaps wants some of those EuroLeague teams involved, as he hinted during that press conference. I think part of the challenge will be that EuroLeague has obviously just renewed its partnership with IMG, who are basically their business arm, handle kind of all of the commercial side of things for the EuroLeague. But yeah, ultimately, I think he sees an opportunity here in the same way that they saw an opportunity in Africa, and feel like that their expertise could potentially help realise some of that potential and unlock new revenue for the NBA. I guess I do wonder, if they weren't able to get those EuroLeague teams involved, I mean, maybe they will. Maybe the EuroLeague teams will sort of see this as more attractive and getting into business with, the biggest basketball organisation in the world. One thing he did say was that it wouldn't involve kind of existing NBA franchises, so we won't have kind of like European iteration of like the Brooklyn Nets or something like that, which I think is kind of a bit of a shame, actually. So I do feel like in Europe, some of those teams in the NBA do have fan bases already, and it might be easier to kind of, if you're launching a pan-European competition, you want to get fans in different market and different countries excited about that, even if, there isn't, say, like a London team. Just having the kind of, Celtics or Nets or Knicks, trying to think some on the West Coast, Lakers, Warriors, like associated with that might be a way of throwing up some of that affinity. But you kind of ruled that out now. But you say it's still at an early stage, but definitely that's very much the first time that we've heard Silver talk so openly about their intentions.
On that point, I think it's probably more of like an export play than an import play for the NBA in terms of not looking to impose its own brands and franchises on the European market, but to build something that is relevant to the European market that could potentially be exported, globally and certainly across the continent, into the US, etc., and therefore play into the, US. That could be talent as well, as a bit of maybe a feeder kind of system into the main kind of NBA North American League. I think it's probably not gone unnoticed that NBA games hosted here, obviously in London and Paris, etc., do very well, and they've been hosting games on European soil for many years. I think 5 of their last 6 MVP awards have gone to European players as well. Obviously 3 of those to Nikola Jokic. But there's clearly, European talent to mine and to bring to the US. And there's a huge following for basketball and therefore a big commercial opportunity in certain markets. When you think of Spain, Germany, Italy, Greece, Turkey, they've got some real strong followings, these multi-club systems across various sports like Real Madrid, like Barcelona, like Fenerbahce, and their basketball teams do very, very well and have a very avid following. And that's kind of ripe for, various commercial opportunities there. And there is a bit of a fractured landscape as well, and a fair amount of discontent, I guess, across leagues and clubs within Europe that I guess the NBA could look to capitalize upon at this particular moment in time. As you say, Sam, EuroLeague's just renewed with ING. They're kind of 10 years into that project of making the EuroLeague a closed shop, which basically, frankly, pissed off quite a few clubs who are now unable to get into the pinnacle of the club game in Europe. There's the Euro Cup as well, which is also operated by EuroLeague Basketball, which is kind of the second tier. But then you've got the FIBA Basketball Champions League as well, which is another competition which kind of was spawned off the back of that discontent. You would have thought if, given the links between the NBA and FIBA, if there is talk of partnering with FIBA on a European league, then the Basketball Champions League would be something that would have to give way. I don't think the European market could accommodate a third kind of European league, pan-continental league, and it would need to be absorbed in some way. But obviously that competition, by definition, doesn't have the Real Madrids, the Barcelonas, the big beast names of European basketball. So they would need to collaborate in some way with the EuroLeague, I guess, if this was to come to fruition. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how it would work. Invariably, he's going to get asked about this around the European games all the time, whether it's the European franchise or a European division or a European league or whatever it may be. He's going to get asked these questions, just as he gets asked about it when they come to the UK. EuroLeague got asked about a EuroLeague franchise or team based in London when they had their Final Four in London many years ago. And then suddenly went quiet and because they've moved their competition elsewhere. And in fact, they got off to the Middle East to broaden their horizons as well. So, the NBA aren't the only ones in Europe looking at other opportunities within and outside the market. So yeah, who knows where this leads? I think it'll rumble on for some time and there's a hell of a lot to figure out with all these various stakeholders involved before you can come up with a fully fledged NBA Europe league.
Yeah, it does feel like there's more momentum around it now than there has been. Like you mentioned that he gets asked about it a lot, but I did watch back his press conference when I was writing the story for our site, and the whole 30-40 minutes was occupied by the prospect of this potential venture. Although those press conferences are always quite funny, like you do get those questions which are kind of, about what would this league look like, who could be involved, those kind of things. And then you do get your questions sandwiched in there about when are you bringing a game to Poland or or when are you coming to Germany? What message do you have for your fans in those markets? And Silver diplomatically bats those away. But yeah, it does feel like there's momentum behind it. I'd be interested to hear what the chief executive of the EuroLeague had to say, Mike, when you speak to him in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, as will I, and I'll certainly be asking him about this or the threat of it or the opportunity, however he sees it, and I will report back, Sam. Don't you worry on this here podcast.
with bated breath.
Indeed, we will wait and see, Mike. I think we'll wrap it there, gents. But before we go, I would just want to draw our listeners' attention to some exclusive Sports Pro Plus content they can access, including Sam's excellent explainer on the latest with TikTok and how a potential ban could impact sport. And next week, members will find a feature about the latest goings on in Milano Cortina with 1 year to go until the 2026 Winter Olympics. And I just realised I should probably get on and write that for you, Sam. Sorry for the hold up there.
Sorry, mate. We've also got a latest edition of 20 Sports Tech Ideas to Invest in Now coming next week as well, which that's why we'll excuse Steve McCaskill's absence, but he'll be on next week to tell us all a little bit more about that, I believe.
Yep. Anyway, yeah, and there's all that and more in the year ahead. So do sign up now to Sports Pro Plus. Just head over to sportspro.com. We've got a Super Bowl explainer as well, I think. And if you haven't already, make sure to listen to this week's episode from our Stream Time sister podcast, which includes a deep dive into what's next for DAZN after its latest financial results. And spoiler alert, they were quite big. But for now, thank you, Mike. And thank you, Sam.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, chaps.